Well, good evening and welcome to the Raymore City Council work session for Monday, October the 18th, 2021. Before we formally get into the items for discussion, I would ask that we recognize the passing of General Colin Powell and offer a moment of silence, please. Thank you. He was a great leader, and if you were in the military while he was around, he was awesome to work for. So now we'll move into the agenda for this evening. Item A is redistricting for or from the census. We have a packet as part of your paperwork here this evening at your workstation, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Fearborn.
Thank you, sir, and I will turn it over to Mr. Carteret. Of course, this is about the latest we've ever brought this to you. You will remember that the data from the census was significantly delayed, so we did not actually receive the local data until the very beginning of September. So we have 4 scenarios in front of you. Mr. Carteret is going to discuss each of them. Just as a reminder to the council, scenario 1 is what we actually have right now. It would require no change. I can say that in the recommended scenario that Mr. Carteret is going to eventually get to, we have done a bit of research. It would mean that all existing boards and commissions in the council are still in their current wards. So there would be no need to make changes there according to code. Mr. Carteret.
Thank you, sir. So as Mr. Fearborn indicated, when we received the actual census results, basically being by census tract, it enabled us to start the work, and we didn't get that information until the first couple of weeks of September. So we know our population increased a little over 19% from 2010. That was a little over 3,700 new residents within our city. So as we started to look at the data and where our residents are living in 2020, we came up in essence with 4 scenarios. And as Mr. Fearborn indicated, scenario 1 is our current boundaries if we didn't have any changes to our current boundaries. Also under the wording where it says scenario 1, so basically the lower right hand corner, it gives you the population count for each ward under our existing boundaries that we currently have. Our lowest ward would be Ward 2 with a little over 5,100 residents, and then Ward 3 is currently our largest ward population-wise at 6,125. So we started looking at trying to maintain some very common boundaries. What are easily defined boundary lines between our different wards? What natural features can we use? What roads can we use? We knew that under our current boundaries, Ward 3 has a very unique situation. We basically call it the boot of Ward 3, which extends across Madison Street. But that line goes down the center of a street. So we have residents living across the street from one another, some in Ward 3, some on the outer perimeter of the roadway being in Ward 4. We know that has created a lot of confusion, and so one of the things that we were, as staff, trying to look at is how do we eliminate that boot? How do we make the boundaries a little bit cleaner, a little bit better defined? So the first new option we have is scenario 2. When you look at scenario 2, it basically is moving the boot from what currently would be Cumberland Hills and Heritage Hills neighborhoods would shift to Ward 4, but scenario 2 had the original town neighborhood shifting to from Ward 4 to Ward 2. So those are the 2 principal changes affecting, and Ward 4, I think, basically stays the same as far as, very similar as far as population count. We're simply shifting, they're adding the Cumberland Hills, Heritage Hills, and they're losing the original town. That's really the only changes in scenario 2. One qualifier there, with scenario 2, you'll see some wording in red. We didn't want the same scenario that happened up in Cumberland Hills, as far as one side of the street being in one district and one ward and the other side being in another. So we took Skyview Drive, and rather than divide it, we made the west side of Skyview Drive all within Ward 4. Scenario 3 proposes probably the most change, if you would. Again, removing Cumberland Hills and Heritage Hills from Ward 3 and adding to Ward 4. So very clean boundary lines for Ward 4 is simply Madison Street. Anything east of Madison Street is Ward 4. And then Ward 2 has some changes. So we moved Stonegate from Ward 1 into Ward 2. And we moved Cedar Ridge from Ward 1 into Ward 2. And then Brookside 10, which is just south of Cedar Ridge, from Ward 1 to Ward 2. And then the Saddlebrook subdivision, recently approved, would also be within Ward 2. Again, this was more of an attempt to try to have a little bit more even numbers, if you would, within the wards. And we were always taking into account the new developments that we foresee as well. So all of our scenarios, we're taking that into account. Where's the development going to occur to balance out the numbers over the next 10 years? So again, with the, we were using the stream basically between Stonegate and Wood Creek as the dividing line, if you would, for Ward 2 versus Ward 1. So those were the main changes there. Scenario 4 is probably what we feel is the cleanest scenario. It is the scenario that staff is recommending. Again, the changes being that taking Cumberland Hills and Heritage Hills out of Ward 3 and moving it to Ward 4. So Ward 3 is clean as far as 58 Highway to the south and Madison Street to the east. Ward 4 is everything east of Madison. Ward 1, the change between Ward 1 and Ward 2 is simply adding Saddlebrook development into Ward 2. Again, Ward 2 probably has the least amount of land area for new development, so allowing the Saddlebrook subdivision and the lots within that to add to the Ward 2 numbers, we felt provided some balance. And again, the dividing line between Ward 1 and Ward 2 we feel is very clean. So this is the recommendation that we have. Again, when you look at the numbers by ward, the differential between the high and the low is about 1,800 residents. But then we start looking at development potential. So scenario 4 has Ward 3 as the smallest population ward. But we also know that Ward 3 is going to experience the greatest growth over the next several years. We have many subdivisions approved or beginning construction there, and feel that that balance of population over the next, even the next few years, will become much tighter with the growth in Ward 3. I think that would conclude staff. I have more details if you want about the changes, but that's a quick overview of what we're proposing.
As staff was reviewing these, perhaps a very simple way to look at it historically is the boot that is in Ward 3 on scenario 1 was artificially created for political reasons. It was one of the it was a compromise position between several members of the council. It was not one of staff's recommendations. A boot does not meet with the compact and contiguous nature of redistricting. Did feel like scenario 2, we simply moved the boot for population figures, but we still have an outlier that we're creating. It's just in a different ward. As Mr. Carteret had indicated, scenario 3, while it has the most changes, and the more changes that we put in that aren't simple, the more it confuses the voting public when it comes time for that. And again, it kind of creates another boot, a really big boot on the west side of Ward 2 there. Again, the reason, as Mr. Cataret indicated, for the ward, or for the scenario 4 being the recommendation, is it has the fewest amount of changes, addresses future population growth trends the best, and has the smallest boot configuration with the little jut to the south there to take in the new subdivision that's going to be coming in. That would conclude staff report on these items.
Thanks. Questions and comments? Anyone? Yes, Mr. Burke.
Before we started, before the presentation started, I had already looked at scenario 4 as being the easiest one to adjust with the changes in my particular situation.
Anyone else? Mr. Holman.
I'm just curious what the process is going forward. Does this come before us as a legislative item with 2 reads like everything else?
Yeah, and the next item that we're going to address, I've asked the mayor if we can insert the rest of the packet that was handed out to you, because we're going to be needing to make some changes really quick. This would come before you for first reading next Monday night. If the council is in agreement on one of these scenarios, is second read the first Monday of November, have time before filing goes into place in December to get them advertised very, very heavily out to the public on what we're doing. And again, the simpler we can make it with addressing future population growth, the better for those advertisements for sure.
Okay. Sonia?
Could you talk just a little bit more about what areas we're expecting more growth in? Maybe a little more detail on that, please.
Absolutely, yeah. And as we look at the developments, I talk a lot about how spread out it is in the city. So each ward will see a little bit of development, some more than others, and I think that's what we try to look at as balancing. When we look at Ward 1, we have a couple of the new projects coming in, the venue of the Good Ranch with the townhomes. We have Prairie View, Sendera, Timber Trail's third phase is coming in. Whitetail Run is coming back for additional phases, and even the Lofts apartment community. So a lot of potential for growth in Ward 1. As I mentioned with Ward 2, Saddlebrook's the main new development. There's a few other small pockets for new homes, but it's really limited to Saddlebrook. Ward 3 has the remainder of Creekmore, so we have all the Eastbrook homes coming in, the Cunningham still to be developed, and a few phases of Edgewater, the Parkside development, Madison Valley, and likely Madison Creek, and then a couple of properties, the 2 undeveloped properties just south of the Hawk Ridge Park. We know there's a lot of activity there. Ward 4, we'll see, of course, Alexander Creek's remaining development. Knoll Creek is back to finish out their development. Oak Ridge Farms currently being constructed. Then the Prairie at Carroll Farms, that's Dr. Carroll's property. So we have a lot of development. We feel most of it is concentrated within Ward 3. As far as the, if you would, the quickest growth potential that we see.
So I guess with that information, my only question about scenario 4 is it's the one that has the biggest discrepancies between the numbers, and it sounds like what I'm hearing about the growth we're expecting isn't necessarily going to even that out a whole lot. Just food for thought.
You mean on scenario 4?
Yeah. Yeah, Ward 1 already almost the biggest. Ward 4 is the biggest and probably will have the smallest. Well, you said Ward 2 would probably be the smallest growth. Ward 4 would probably be second, but quite a bit in Ward 1, and it's already pretty high.
As we looked at
I guess in my mind, I was thinking our goal is to make the numbers pretty equal, and that doesn't seem to be making the numbers pretty equal to me.
trying to balance what we looked at. The biggest gap in scenario 4 is between Ward 3 and Ward 4. And that gap is about 1,800 residents right now. We believe it'll be, less, certainly, over the next 5 to 10 years as population occurs within Ward 3. There still likely will be a gap. That what becomes difficult then is if you try to make those numbers even looking at potential growth as you come up with some really wacky boundary lines. And so we really felt that keeping the very clean lines with major roadways or streams was the best, as long as we could get the gap to be a little bit less than what it currently is, and we think we're doing that with this scenario.
Do you have something, Mr. Behrens?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I like scenario 4 for the simple fact I think it's easiest for our residents to look at this and say, okay, it's divided as straight a line as you can really possibly draw. So I think for the residents, I think Ward 4 is simple. I would add, I think that if we are going to possibly look at annexation in the future, that would it be fair to say that Ward 4 would probably benefit the most from annexation? Is that something that we factored in or need to factor in?
We consider it as a factor, but unless we annex existing neighborhoods, there's not a lot of potential for dense development. You look at the land mass of Ward 4, it's almost twice as much land even than the other wards, but there's a lot of very, very low density, very rural, RE type development. And that's what we see with some of the annexation areas, except when you look to the northeast where we have existing neighborhoods. There's not the potential for dense development because it's just not sewered. So without that, I think even with the annexation, we're not going to see a huge increase of numbers.
Mr. Burt?
Question for staff. Is the redistricting process, or is it an ordinance, or I'm sure it's a statute, is it supposed to address possible future growth, or is it supposed to address what we see has been counted?
Absolutely addresses possible future growth, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Barber?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I like the scenario 4 from the, like John had said, when you're looking east and west of Madison, at least on our end, it's easier for the citizens to see where they're at, and there's always been some confusion behind the post office there. My second question is, and I think you said this, but this scenario 4 doesn't impact any of the boards or commissions that people that are serving currently?
That is correct, sir.
Anyone else want to weigh in? There's kind of a second half to this particular topic, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Fearborn to bring that up.
Well,
So I'm
hearing nothing otherwise, we will be bringing scenario 4 to you for your legislative
gonna say.
action next Monday night.
Okay.
Correct, Mr. Zur?
Thank you, Mr. Fearborn.
No, I was asking if I was just correct in the statement I made, but you were moving on me.
I was moving on you.
Okay.
I agreed with that statement by moving on.
So let me introduce this first.
Sure.
I'm sure you have all heard in one form or another that the filings for candidacy for next year has changed. The state legislature, in their wisdom, made the determination that for certain cities, the time frame for filing was moved to an earlier date, and the time that you can file has been shrunk by a third. With that being said, I'm going to let Mr. Zur kind of detail it, and then we'll get into some of the background.
Thank you, Mr. Fearborn. I'm happy to provide the background on this. This all stems from House Bill number 271 from last year, which provided a smorgasbord of changes throughout the ordinances for this, throughout the revised statutes of Missouri. In particular, one provision did impact upon the municipal elections. One item that you've been receiving is the 2022 Missouri election calendar as provided by the Missouri Secretary of State. You'll note on there the new dates, which would be the first day for candidate filing of December 7th, 2021, last day of candidate filing of December 28th, 2021. This, in essence, moves the first day for candidate filing from the 11th Tuesday, my apologies, let me rephrase that, from the 15th Tuesday before the election to the 17th Tuesday before the election, and from the 11th for closing of that candidate filing from the 11th Tuesday before to the 14th Tuesday before. It does shorten the time frame that you've got here, and I anticipate that we'll be able to talk about that a little bit more. From my perspective, in reviewing the code and the charter, the language of the statutory provisions, which you've also been provided and are highlighted, indicate that the opening date for filing of declaration of candidacy, and this is on section 115.127, indicates that a political subdivision or a special district is not required by law or charter. So the opening filing date shall be 8 a.m. the 17th Tuesday prior to the election. The closing date for the filing or declaration of candidacy for an office in a political subdivision or special district is not required by law or charter. The closing filing date shall be 5 p.m. the 14th Tuesday prior to the election. In our particular case, we do have charter, which does make reference with regard to municipal elections. The charter, which has also been provided to you and highlighted, under section 9.1 provides that the council by ordinance may further regulate elections subject to the provisions of this charter and applicable state law. The council has in fact regulated, and they do so by the Code of Ordinances. In this particular case, they have done so by section 105.030 of the Code of Ordinances, which provides that the filing deadline would be the 15th Tuesday prior and the 11th Tuesday prior to the next for opening and closing. This conformed with the prior statutory provisions. There is an argument to be made that because we have included this as part of the charter and then referenced in the ordinances, that we could maintain the original filing deadlines that were provided to us that would have gone back to the 11th and the 15th dates for that. This is fine as far as legal is concerned, but I would note that there may be some benefit to changing it in order to match up with what the statutory provisions are. The changing it would avoid confusion amongst voters, in my opinion. It would also avoid the potential for any individual coming forward and making any argument for an election discrepancy of any type. Obviously, the statutes aren't going to change anytime in the near future, and pulling that into alignment may make sense there. It was also make sure that we don't have any timing problems with regard to the delivery of candidacy forms and materials to the county or the Secretary of State. It also allows the staff side of it to kind of ease references, because we don't have to do anything other than look back at the 2022 Missouri election calendar every year. We don't have to recalculate based upon what code and ordinance says on our side. I present those to you. I believe Mr. Fearborn might have a little bit more a different opinion with regard to that, but I don't necessarily disagree. I think the council absolutely has discretion to make its determination how it wants to proceed forward, whether it maintains the current provisions of charter and code, or alternatively adopts under the code the provisions from 115.127.
I would not call it a differing opinion, but I want the council to be aware of all of your options, most certainly, so it'll be kind of like a point-counterpoint, I suppose. The history of this is, and again, I balance what Mr. Zur has said. The council could run the risk management in me says somewhere down the road, if we are the only organization that is keeping it at the 11th and 15th rather than the new language, somebody down the road could say, I'm upset because I lost the election, and so I'm going to sue the city because you have a completely different set of rules, even though it gave me more time to file and you advertised the time to file. You're not doing it the way other cities are doing it, and it opens up to that particular liability. Most certainly know that. I suppose the balance to that, and that probably outweighs this, the history of this particular piece of legislation at the state began, you will all remember last year, The state attempted to remove the municipal elections entirely and have candidates file and be elected and bond issues go through at the general election. I wonder if this isn't an encroachment into trying that again, because the filing terms for the general election have not been touched. So it would be one of those, we're moving it, but the syrup we're giving you is we're going from the 3 weeks to file to the longer period for the general election. That is coupled with the fact that the Secretary of State has announced that he is going to be introducing legislation next year to have local elections be partisan. You will have to declare what party you are declaring your candidacy under. I think that that is a long shot, but I also see this change as the beginning of a pattern of trying to take over local control of elections. And so I lay that out for the council for your discussion this evening. If I was going to make a recommendation, the risk manager in me is always going to prevail. And it always worries me that anybody can file a lawsuit these days, and certainly that would open us up if we do not change this language, which is a pretty simple thing to do. We would be introducing it to you next Monday night if you so choose to change the language.
Real quickly, just to follow up on that, I did review both the Missouri Municipal League as well as the Missouri Municipal Attorneys Association listservs in preparation for this, and there is not a whole lot of chatter on it. I would say that in contacting with the Jackson County Election Board, and I just have contacts over there that I reached out to, it did seem to indicate that they had a number of entities that were changing in order to conform with the proposed language. I'm not saying we have to by any stretch, but again, it appears that that's the direction that most of the individual municipalities are headed.
And anything out of the Missouri Municipal League about it? Nothing? Okay.
No, sir.
Well, if there are a lot of municipalities in the area that are moving, it would seem wise to do the same. But Mr. Holman, did you have a question?
Yes, sir. I'm going to be staying firmly opposed to you on that. I'm absolutely and apparently opposed to this. It's very specific in this. It says, if not required by law or charter. Our charter is very specific, and I believe this is a move to get partisan elections and as Mr. Fearborn said, control. There's no way on earth I support this. I say we stand fast. We have to stand our ground. If someone files suit against us, so be it. I think they lose, and we remain above board because of the way state statute's written and our charter's written. I think, again, this is a push by partisan political interest at the state legislative level to try and impact what goes on in the municipalities, and I'm not for it.
Well, the only way I would agree with that is if we had a bunch of other cities that were willing to join us in some kind of class action against the state, because they will come after us. And Mr. Burke, go ahead.
I agree with Councilman Holman 100%. I don't think that we spent a year working on our charter to just throw it away.
Sonia?
From my point of view, we want to encourage people to be part of our local government, and it can be quite confusing for people who haven't done that before or who are just starting to learn about it. I think if we can keep it the same as the state, if I get onto a state website, the information is the same as what it would be for Raymore, as far as someone figuring out what do I need to do to step up and serve the citizens of my community. So I would be in favor of changing it just to make it easy for people to understand the process, to understand the timeline of the process, and like Mr. Fearborn said, I think to keep us safe from any potential issues. You know, if I see this calendar on the state website that says the last day to file is here, and then I hear that people are filing in Raymore past that date, then, you know, people could likely get quite upset about that and file suit against the city, feeling like it's not fair. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Mr. Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We went through a recent change in the code, I believe, to kind of remove some specifics and refer to the state statute in a lot of areas. With this would kind of be an outlier to that. What we've just done would it not, that we've just changed a lot of things that were very specific, but because the laws may change, we reworded our code to refer to the state statute in some of those areas.
Most of those were in the law enforcement area, but where they're used constantly day in and day out, sir.
So in that
And not part of our charter, actually. That's part of our code.
code.
This is in
correct.
our charter.
This is in our charter. Okay.
Ron, did you have something?
How much time do we have to make a decision on this?
If the change is going to go into place, it would have to be in, literally, as the first page shows, December 2nd would be the first day for filing if you change the language to mirror the state. 2 readings in November. So we only have 1 reading left.
It seems like
Regular session.
too big of an issue for the MML not to be involved in. Can we take some time and try to reconnect with the MML and see if anybody else locally is doing anything?
Especially as it relates to charter cities.
Yeah, I would really like to hear their input and maybe take some more time to see if any other cities kind of feel the same way as Mr. Holman does, because I think he makes a good point.
Yeah.
I don't support making a decision right now if we don't have to. Just my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Problem is, we're running down to a deadline.
Yeah, but I mean, it's been in front of me for 10 minutes. And
Filing.
it's, I know,
Right.
but
Any suggestions?
We can reach out to MML and come back to you at your next work session, which would still be a week before the next legislative session. Your next legislative session.
I won't be at that work session November 1, but
okay.
you can still bring it up.
The other option is if Mr. Zur is confident that the existing language covers, you can make this decision anytime during the year. If we got into the year and we saw that it was confusing for folks after this next election cycle,
Push through this election cycle.
then you can make a change to the code at any point in time that you would want to, have this one last one to see if it causes a problem. If it doesn't, then come back and revisit with the council at a later. Would you agree with that, Mr. Zur?
Yeah, I would.
I didn't want you nodding your head no.
But how would it interfere with the results of that election? Would it interfere with it at all?
That's why I think Mr. Zur said it would bear a good conversation with the county clerk
Okay.
relative to, you're going to be okay with this because we're going to be filing on different dates.
Gotcha.
I'm going to ask an answer to Mr. Zur. The answer is no, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do we have anything we can do to push back on the partisan portion of the elections coming up as well, too?
The partisan portion is not before you at this time.
I understand, but there's-
That would be a legislative decision for the next legislative session down at the state of Missouri, or the legislature. Beyond your conversations with MML lobbyists and representatives, at this time, a little premature to make any determination there. We haven't seen any of the language for it at this point
Okay.
either.
The pre-filing will be in December for January for the next session.
Okay.
Because it is coming from the Secretary of State, it'll probably be one of the first ones in for pre-filing. I am certain MML is going to take a very strong position on this.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't feel comfortable changing the way we handle our filings and elections, just because the state I haven't heard any reason other than they have told us we need to do that. And if there was a valid reason, if it was causing issues, if there was some monetary reason or whatever, I would consider that, but I haven't heard anything other than we want you to do this and this is how you're going to do it. And I agree we've got it in our charter, and Mr. Burke's right, worked hard putting that together. If we start changing every time they tell us we have to do something just because they're telling us to do it, I think what's the point in having a charter?
It does seem to usurp the charter's authority. Yep, that's for sure. Mr. Burke?
One thing that I hear a lot of the people that are in power in Jeff City right now is for years, they say, we want local control because we know what's best for our people. I hear that constantly, and now suddenly they're throwing that out. I don't see how that could be such a strong opinion for so many different local groups than to all of a sudden think that that was ridiculous for 20 years or 10 years.
Mr. Townsend, do you have something?
With this change, did that change any of the campaign filings or anything of that sort? Is this just strictly with respect to the candidacy filings? Candidate filings, thank you. It's just candidate filings, so there's no impacts to the down the other deadlines and things of that sort.
But I think that it would. I think that's why you have to get something back from the state's
So even if we
Secretary
were
of
to
State.
stick with our definition in our charter, they still would have to follow the filings for the campaign filings, things of that sort on the
Exactly.
website. So there's that level of confusion as well. Okay.
Exactly. Mr. Zurich?
I just want to make sure we're crystal clear on it. We would not have to change the charter. Charter remains the same. We don't have to impact upon that one. It'd simply be, if we are going to go this route, a change of the Code of Ordinances, which has more specific language in it. The charter indicates that you all have the ability to make adjustments to the election based upon it. No language under charter would have to be altered.
Okay. So it's our code that actually outlines the dates, not the charter.
Yeah, in essence, in order to get to the notion of we are in compliance without making any changes, you do have to make a two-step process. The first step being, okay, I'm going to look at my charter. The charter says that by ordinance we can affect the election provisions. Then you go to your ordinances, and that's where you find your specificity as to the dates for candidate filings.
The charter empowers the code.
That's right.
Anya, did you?
Excellently put.
I was just going to say, I mean, we could probably list off many, many times we've changed our code based on direction from the state. I don't feel like that's so unusual. I do understand, that we want to maintain our power in the city, and that we want to be sure that they don't take this as the first step to take more power away, so to speak, but I fail to see how standing strong on this is going to keep them from taking any further power. I guess in my opinion, that's going to happen by having conversations with our representatives at the state level, communicating with them what we want to see, but digging in our heels on this issue, I don't feel like is a great way to try to communicate that.
Mr. Holman?
I'm not seeing where we're really digging our heels in on anything. This law is very specific. It says, if the opening date, blah, 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 is not required by law or charter. Our charter says it is required. Very specific. And it says what our filing times are and when our elections are. It's very straightforward. They leave us an out. Just because everybody else is bailing off the boat doesn't mean we should.
I'm suffering from it, and I pause here as well. Uncomfortable. Yeah. Well, without a consensus here, I can see us kind of laboring over this issue for a while until we get some further clarification from either MML or the
County Clerk.
We will get in touch with the county clerk, with MML, and we will survey the metropolitan charter cities on the Missouri side
All right.
to find out if they're going to avail themselves of this language or not.
Okay. I think that's fair. Mr. Circo.
Well, then what I see here, if we're going to wait, if we don't do anything, there's no problem. If we decide to change, then we're backs against the wall on time. So we'll hear what everything in MML and what we're doing. Because there is 5 weeks in November, 5 Mondays, if it came to that, because you have to have on 2 different readings. I mean, if you're kind of pushing that on that cut. So, I mean, first let's hear from that, and then we'll know whether the 5 weeks in November or 5 Mondays gives us an option to call special sessions if we need to get a reading before December, if that goes that way. And I will not be here on November 1st either. I will send you an email. It's in my phone, but I started cooking dinner and I got busy and forgot to send it. So my wife told me to cook dinner and shut up, so I did. Good job.
Okay. More research, but we will have the item, scenario 4 on the agenda.
That is correct,
For
sir.
consideration, okay. All right, thank you. Moving on to the next item, the COVID fund source and uses. Sir?
Thank you. The primary purpose of this is we have brought this particular issue to you all kind of piecemeal several different times. I just wanted to be able to put it in front of you very, very briefly, not looking for any kind of action, just this is more of an informational item. Kind of wait till those get passed out. So what you have in front of you are really two different spreadsheets. You'll remember the funding, the funding from the federal government has come to us in under two different acts. The CARES Act was the first one, and the ARPA funding was the second and will be the third source of funding. Just to kind of walk you through this, the CARES Act funding we initially received was $1,124,198.46. There have been 3 specific draws approved by the county against that particular funding. The $31,000 you see there, the $9,000, and the $123,000, which has actually been kind of cash to cash against that $1,124,000 and has reduced that amount. We then applied $1,751,000. This was last year. We applied $1,751,335.08, which we could do against the total of PD salaries, just the police department, from last year. That left salaries remaining that could be applied to the ARPA funds from the get-go of $790,974.26. So then we have received, and what we know is with the ARPA funding, we are also allowed to claim what we have paid out of the general fund in police department and now dispatch salaries against those funds. Remember, that's all accrual accounting and supplement accounting. We're not actually drawing cash away from those funds. We're applying the general fund application of those salaries against the ARPA funding. So what you see is we've received the first payment of $2,239,214.49. Next September, that will be duplicated. Again, we have, so then you see the total of $4,478,428.98 in ARPA funding that we will have received by the end of September of next year. We go back and apply that that remaining $799,74.26 of police department salaries against that amount, and that reduces, using accrual accounting, that amount to $3,687,454.72. So what we will be doing is applying the current fiscal year's salaries and next year's fiscal year salaries against that remaining $3,687,454.72, and we will actually end up running out the back end of that. That's all so that we can tell the federal government we have applied the correct, an acceptable expense against those funds. Now down below is taking all of that accrual, flipping it over and giving you a ducky horsey kind of a cash-based accounting of all of those funds. So we received $1,124,198.46. We spent $244,322.46 against those funds, cash basis, meaning that we have placed into the restricted revenue fund, and you'll remember we did a budget amendment for this of $879,876 against those funds. Still using police department salaries on the accrual basis, but those salaries are already budgeted in the general fund. Same thing for next year, same thing for 2023, and so, or 2021 and 2022, which will use up those funds and all of the ARPA funding, but we will have received and have now placed the $2,239,214 into the restricted fund. And next year, we will repeat that process, place it into the restricted revenue funds, which means that there, between the total ARPA funding of $4,478,428.98 and the 879 CARES Act funding, 879,000 in CARES Act funding, you add those two numbers together, there will be $5,358,304.98 in the restricted revenue fund, which the council, which will have been properly accounted for against PD salaries. That money will be sitting in the restricted revenue fund, possibly for a future justice center and police station for the city, combined with bond issue monies somewhere down the road, is what currently staff is kind of recommending to the council that you use. Of course, they'll be in there and for years and years and years to come, so.
Question?
What kind of interest do we draw on that restricted revenue balance, since we're not using that money this whole time?
Our 12 month tie-up in securities is currently earning 0.008%, and our 6 month is currently earning 0.004.
Digging out, guys.
I think it's like $12. I mean, it's
Yeah,
pitiful
not much,
right
yeah.
now.
We can't do anything.
That's bidding them out, sir, to the highest bidder.
Yeah.
We're getting about 7 or 8 bids citywide. I mean, we can only put it into certain restricted securities.
We can't buy Bitcoin with it.
It's terrible.
Thank you. So based on the figures you've provided here, nothing is, in a sense, budgeted against this. This is all, so should federal government do something squirrel and says, we're not going to give you the FY22 monies, we're not budgeted against that for expenses or anything?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, Mr. Barber.
So I get this square, in, I forget what accounting you call this, but by doing this, we can have our Justice Center, but not have it tied to the COVID, or CARES Act funds. You're taking the police salaries and spending that down. It's already budgeted, and just moving in a fund so we can keep this $5 million for as long as it takes to keep whatever we assign that for done.
Correct, sir. The long form of it, when we eventually do our reporting to the federal government, will be if we have $2 million in public safety funding coming out of the general fund, we would not spend that out of the general fund. The amount would go to fund balance. We would use the COVID dollars in that budget line item for public safety and dispatch salaries. And then take from the available fund balance in the exact same amount, move that over into the restricted revenue fund for a future. That will be the accounting associated with that for the auditors. That concludes staff report, and it
Okay.
was just informational.
Thank you. If there's nothing else, we'll move along. Somebody have anything else? Move on to the FY 21-22 budget. And we've already had our first reading, haven't we?
That's correct, sir. This was just, we always put it on every work session until the bidder end, and so we thought we'd have it on there if council had anything else.
Nobody has has anything. I think the first reading kind of speaks for itself, so we'll move on to item D, which is the joint meeting dates. You want to talk about those?
Thank you, sir. If y'all have a pencil or your phones in hand, it is time to begin our joint meetings again now that we're seeing the ability to get out of COVID. For next calendar year, 2022, staff is proposing the following, and the mayor and I spoke, to the degree possible going forward in the future, we would really like, if it is at all possible, to schedule these joint meetings for the fifth Monday. There's one fifth Monday in every single quarter, and we have 4 joint meetings, and it's always kind of uncomfortable if we're all sitting at the big table and then we dismiss whoever we're having, and then we're moving on to other business and we're waiting for them to get out the door. And so, unfortunately, next year there are only 2 fifth Mondays that are available. Otherwise, we would be meeting on Halloween night, which is a fifth Monday, and we would be meeting on Memorial Day. Memorial Day will always be a little bit of a problem. But for the Planning and Zoning Commission, staff is proposing January 31st, 2022 for the joint meeting with P&Z. For the Park Board joint meeting, May 16th. For the Arts Commission joint meeting, August 29th. And for the joint meeting with the Chamber, October 17th. That concludes staff report on this item, sir.
Thank you. Any comments on that? Okay, that moves us on to other. Anybody have anything they'd like to bring up at the work session? Mr. Barber.
I just wanted to say I would not be at next Monday's council meeting. I'll be on vacation. Potentially might want to try to do it online. Staying somewhere where I haven't stayed before, so I don't know how robust the internet is, and kind of depends how my day goes. But I'll get a hold of staff to see if I can't get online, and you're going to be
I'm
gone
out
as
too,
well.
yeah.
So Reginald will be running the meeting. All right, thanks.
If there's nothing else, we'll stand adjourned. Oh, we have to go to executive session, that's right. Is there a motion to go to executive session?
Sure, I move we move into executive session.
Okay, is there a second?
Yes, sir, I'll second the motion.
Okay, the motion is made and seconded to move into executive session as authorized by RSMO 610.021, parent 2, which is real estate.
Roll call.
Councilman Berenson,
Yes.
Councilman Holman,
Yes.
Councilwoman Abdelgawad,
Yes.
Councilman Barber,
Yes.
Councilman Townsend,
Yes.
Councilman Burke, Councilman Serco,
Yes.
Councilwoman Will Scherzer.
Yes.
Excellent.
All right, we are in exec.